One of the most famous philosophers and theologians of the 19th century, Søren Kierkegaard, has said, it's only important that Luther had married. It's quite unimportant whom. He could have married a doorpost. End of quote. It seems Søren Kierkegaard, who was never married by the way, was in error.
Katharina von Bora Luther lived from 1499 to 1552. She's best known as the ex-nun who married Martin Luther. Katie Luther was a woman of the Middle Ages, in one respect ordinary, at the same time exceptional. For a woman of the Middle Ages to be remembered at all is significant. She would need to be a royal celebrity or an influential writer who left a written testimony, or an exceptional person spiritually, a religious leader with exemplary faith, a saint. Katie wasn't any of these.
Most people know Katie as the ex-nun who married Luther, and we know that she was of noble birth. She was born 29th of January in 1499 to a family that used to be wealthy in Lippendorf, but family who had lost their wealth. And that might be one reason why Katharina was sent to a monastery at a very young age.
The family was very poor because normally people were expected to bring a gift along when entering a monastery, and her father paid only 30 groschen, which is a very, very measly sum compared to what's normal.
It's interesting that Katie was sent to the convent right after her mother died, and her father remarried Margareta von Ende. And it sounds like an evil stepmother came, and that's why the little girl was sent away, but that is not necessarily the case, but we don't know. But we do know that she went to a convent in Nimschen.
The monastery in Nimschen was a large one, quite rich, and it seems that quite a lot of what housekeeping meant in the early 16th century, Katie has learned there.
When she was sent to the convent, she was 5 years old. When she was sent to another convent, she was 10 years old. And at that point, it seemed that her destiny was sealed. Her family had no money for a dowry, which was needed to marry her well. Her family didn't want her back, which must have broken her heart. I mean, why didn't they want her back?
While Katie was at the convent, Augustinian monk and theologian Martin Luther began questioning the Church's practice of selling indulgences. He also questioned the role of monastic life. There can be little doubt that Katie and other nuns learned of the tumultuous events taking place to the north, in Wittenberg. Katharina von Bora and Martin Luther were about to cross paths. Exactly how remains a mystery.
The most influential book in that time on the question of what the future of nuns and monks should be is Luther's On the Votes of Monks. There is one very, very rare edition, obviously done in Grimma, quite near the monastery, in 1522. So it really seems that the intention was to smuggle it into the convent.
We don't know what exactly Katharina heard or learned, but she must have been aware of Martin Luther's criticism of the monastic life, based on his own experience, his own frustration that he's trying so hard to please God, to find the perfection, and it doesn't seem to be working. And the revelation that justification comes from faith alone. You don't have to live in a monastery to do that. You can live holy life outside. You can get married, have children, live ordinary life, and that's holy and sacred. That was the message that these women heard loud and clear.
In the early morning hours, Easter Day, 1523, 12 nuns fled the convent in Nimschen. A popular legend describes the nuns fleeing in the back of a fish wagon owned by a friend of Luther's.
There's always a question, how many nuns fled the monastery? The evidence points to 12, but only 9 nuns arrived in Wittenberg. The other 3 obviously got back to their own families because they lived in the region of the Luther friend Frederick the Wise, the Saxon prince, whereas the 9 who came to Wittenberg had their families in the territories of Prince George, who was deeply opposed against Luther, so they had to flee to Wittenberg.
This is quite a scandal. There's Easter Sunday and all these nuns coming. These were not the first nuns to leave their orders, but this is the first time it happens in Wittenberg. And these ladies come to Luther, who was feeling very much responsible for them. Most of them found a home easily. Some of them went home, some of them married. But then there is 3 left. One of them is Katharina. And then she's the last one left. Nobody seemed to want her.
To be unmarried for more than 2 years in Wittenberg, staying all alone without a family, which means the social background which kept you as a person in the early 16th century, is quite a remarkable feat. It shows that she was a strong, independent, and even strong-willed person.
She fell in love with a beautiful, handsome, rich man, Hieronymus Baumgartner, I guess Jerome in English. They fell in love, they planned to get married. This is a very prestigious young man falling in love with Katharina, which proves wrong all the assumptions that she was unattractive, difficult, not marriageable, not marriage material. She was. She got one of the best. Problem was, this man's family didn't want their precious son marrying an ex-nun who had no money.
When his family found out about the thing, they whisked him back to Nuremberg and married him to a much younger and very suitable person from noble descent and with quite a lot of money in the background.
This man leaves saying, I will be back in a few months, we'll get married, we have children, live happily ever after. And he rides away, Katharina waves goodbye. Hieronymus's parents forbid him ever to go back to Katharina, not to even write to her. They quickly arrange an engagement with Sibylla Dichtel, a very wealthy, beautiful young teenager. And Katharina hears about this, a rumor, an announcement. Never ever heard from Hieronymus again. Her heart is broken.
So Kathy still remained unmarried and on Luther's hand. He tried to marry her off to a colleague of his, somebody called Caspar Glatz, and Kathy declined.
I wish we had a picture of him, but the way Katharina responded to his proposal was like, no way. She said, I have no love, no desire in myself for him, period. She would not marry for the safety. This was a good man. No way.
If she could not have Amsdorf or Luther, she would remain a spinster.
Nicholas von Amsdorf was a determined bachelor, and we can assume that Katharina knew that was an absurdity. Nicholas would not get married. But Luther, after all, he's the one who started it. He was writing all these treatises, how wonderful marriage is, how good it is. He could get married, although he had waited pretty long. All the other reformers were married at this point. He was not. And there probably were reasons for that. He was too busy writing. He had no time for looking for a wife. And also he knew that his life was in danger. He was a good man. He probably thought that if I get married, I drag a decent woman into my misery. But there was something in Katharina that made him change his mind.
We're not quite sure how romantic love played a role in this thing. You see, this kind of love is an invention of the 19th century. The idea in the early 16th century is that people should like each other when marrying, and love starts after the marriage, not before.
Katie and Martin's married life began amid the backdrop of the Peasants' War. Luther sided with the nobility and now had Pope and peasants looking for his head. It didn't appear to be the best of times to get married.
It was quite a big surprise for everybody in Wittenberg when the marriage in June 1525 was announced. Even Luther's best friend, Philip Melanchthon, was not informed beforehand and consequently was not invited to the marriage, which he resented deeply.
First they got engaged and consummated the marriage in front of witnesses. They had a brief and simple ceremony. Bugenhagen, the pastor of the city church in Wittenberg, married the couple. And 2 weeks later, June 27th, they have a big celebration, a parade through the town. Students are there, protesters and jeers. A lot of demonstrators against the marriage joined the parade.
The negative reaction to Luther's marriage from the Roman Catholic side could be expected. But the negative reaction of his friends and of the Reform front was something which surprised Luther himself. The problem was that in the eyes of his followers he had made himself wide open to traditional criticism. The best known is of course the one of King Henry VIII from England, who explained that this would be the true revelation of the Reform spirit. The monk just wanted to get married. That's what the whole Reformation is all about.
Some people said, marry anybody but not her. There was something in Katharina's personality, in her strength, in her being who she was, that made some people uncomfortable.
And so the young couple, which wasn't so young by the way anymore, he was 43, and what's more important, she was 26, quite old for marriage at that time, had not an easy start. The Prince Elector gave away the monastery as a kind of silent gift, but only a third of the house at that time was habitable. People, especially the prince, expected Luther to move with his wife into some more suitable, to a more suitable home along the lines Philip Melanchthon got 10 years later as a gift. But it was Kathy who decided to stay and built the house, set up a household which cannot be compared to anything we normally have today. It's more like a convention center coupled with a student's home, sometimes an infirmary. Kathy took over the economic rule of the household. Luther had no idea about money and what to do with that. His only idea was to spend it.
She saw it was very important for them to buy something permanent, and that was land. She's a noble lady, she loves land. So she convinces Luther that they can invest and buy a piece of land, a farm of Schulsdorf.
She was the managing director of a middling enterprise, and she had her servants to control. And we know from the sources that those servants were quite often not very easy to control, so she had quite a lot to do. What made her most famous was her own brewery.
Luther was very fond of her beer. She was in charge of making good German beer, and everybody enjoyed that, the students, the visitors, and especially Luther. And Katharina was in charge of all that, because Luther was busy being Luther, writing, teaching, arguing, having beer, having conversation. He was to give fabulous wedding gifts and throw huge banquets until Katie came in and said, no way, we have to feed our family and our guests. Luther was very eccentric, very difficult man to live with, very high-maintenance spouse. He was sometimes probably smelly. I mean, he didn't really take care of his hygiene or diet or anything. Once his bed was rotting, he just forgot to change the straw. Katie knew all about this. And this was an older man, 42-year-old. Katharina was 26. So what was the attraction there? If there was attraction, it was probably on a spiritual and intellectual and mental level. Katharina must have had tremendous respect towards Luther, even before they married. And once they got married, her respect and love shows in her always deferring to her doctor in public.
When Luther finished the Bible translation in 1534, he wanted, of course, that his wife should read it. But how to incite her to do that? So he promised her 50 guilders if she would read through the whole Bible within 6 months. She did, and he paid.
He had this very weird habit that when he felt ill, he would lock himself into the study. And Katharina waited for 3 days, 4 days, and thought, this is it, and had the door taken down. And there's Luther looking at her. What did I do wrong? Well, Katie thought it's better to eat something good and fixed a nice meal, and Luther felt better.
The children they had were 6 in number. 2 died very early.
Katie and Luther lost 2 of their children. Elizabeth, young daughter, Jesus died. And later, Magdalena Lenchen died at the age of 13. 2 daughters, Katie and Martin, loved tremendously. They loved all their children. They would have died for any of their children. But when you lose a child, you really realize what you're losing. And they were devastated by the loss of that.
As the story of the Reformation unfolded around them, Katie and Martin's relationship developed into a deep, abiding love and mutual respect.
Besides being the managing director, she was also the partner of Luther in his life. She was the only woman allowed into the circle of the table talk. After the meals, which were taken downstairs with the whole family and the servants and friends, Luther and his friends and the more influential visitors went upstairs in his preserved room, where they had their after-dinner cup and the famous table talk, which was written down by the students who attended. So the writers were quite unhappy with the active role she played. They called her the Doctorissa, which is an artificial word meaning doctor's wife, but even more meaning a female doctor, something which was unthinkable for the 16th century. And there were quite a lot of people, friends of Luther's, who asked him to curb the tongue of his wife a bit. Actually, he never did.
It is through letters written to Katie that we learn about a relationship that began as a practical matter and grew into a romance.
He would call Katie my morning star of Wittenberg. He starts writing of this cherished Herzliebe, Carissima, my beloved one, my dearest one, whom he wouldn't change for Venice or Florence or France or anything. A woman he loves dearly. It's not that usual for a medieval, late medieval, Renaissance man, unless he's a poet, to write about his love and affection in quite a public manner, and to talk about his love, and to write letters, love letters to his wife. Luther, this monk, fell in love with Katharina von Bora.
Luther wrote to Katie from the Marburg Castle, where he and Swiss reformer Ulrich Zwingli squared off in a debate about the real presence of Christ in the communion elements.
Grace and peace in Christ, dear Lord Katie. You should know that our amiable colloquy at Marburg has come to an end, and we are in agreement on almost all points, except that the opposition insists on affirming that there's only simple bread in the Lord's Supper and on confessing that Jesus Christ is spiritually present there. Say good night to all and pray for us. We are all still alert and healthy and live like kings. Kiss the children on my behalf. Your obedient servant, Martin Luther.
While Luther's friends met in Augsburg presenting the Augsburg Confession, the outlawed Luther was housed at the Feste Coburg, where he wrote to Katie.
To my dearly beloved Catherine Luther, mistress of the house at Wittenberg, I have received all of your letters. This is the 4th letter I'm writing to you. Together with the box, I have also received the picture of Lenchen. At first I did not recognize the little strumpet. If only there will finally be an end to the diet. We have done and offered enough. The papists do not want to give a hair's breadth.
In the last weeks before his death in Eisleben, Luther shared news of his declining health.
My dearly beloved mistress of the house, Katharina Luther, a doctor, the lady of Zollesdorf and of the pig market, and whatever else she is capable of being. Before all else, grace and peace in Christ, and my old, poor, and as your grace knows, powerless love, your loving Martin Luther, who has grown old.
Katharina was afraid of losing Luther, as Luther had been afraid of losing Katharina. Earlier when Katharina was sick, Luther had said something like, "Don't just die and leave me, you can't go." Katie did all she could. She did the best of medicine, the best of beer, the best of care. And yet Luther had to travel. He just couldn't stop traveling. Luther died away from Katie. He died with 2 of his sons in his presence when he died. Katie was far away. She had gotten Luther's letter a few days before he died. She was heartbroken. Interestingly enough, and again a sign of Katie's extraordinary nature, is that she inherited Luther. Women didn't inherit their husbands. It was the oldest son who inherited, and he would be then the guardian of the property and take care of the mother. Luther, before he died, made a will and let Katie know this, that you will inherit me, that I'll make sure that you'll have the land.
Following Luther's death in 1546, war and plague broke out in the region.
In this war, she had to flee twice Wittenberg because of the invasion of the Spaniards. And she was afraid for her own life and for the life of her children, which she took with her. And both those escapes were so expensive that she lost nearly everything she got from Luther in cash.
Luther died in 1546. Katie died 1552. She had to go on for 6 more years. And those years were the most difficult in her life because after Luther died, there was no funding. We have some letters to Christian III, King of Denmark, whose father had been her friend, asking for his financial support, for his support to get money from the elector. It must have been very humiliating for her also, but also she saw that that was necessary. She was fighting for her children.
I am moved by urgent need in the hope that your Royal Highness will look graciously upon my unworthy epistle, written by a poor widow, now abandoned by all and sundry.
And then in 1552, plague hit Wittenberg again, at this time really bad, and basically everybody left. So Katie packed her horses and left. And on the way, horse got scared of something, and she tried to tame the horse, fell from the horse, got injured, fell in the cold water, and probably died out of those injuries and pneumonia a few months later. So she was buried in Torgau, which is not her home. But because of the political situation, that's where she had to be buried.
You see, every time projects its own ideas into the 16th century. And of course, German professors writing about Katie in the 19th century couldn't imagine that the wife plays a more important role than just providing 3 meals and a clean bed every day. But what happened in the 16th century with the Luther family was clearly different. They had their own independent lives, and she was more important for showing Luther, the monk, the everyday life and the importance of the everyday life for the simple people than everybody else could have done.
She symbolizes the sacredness of everyday life, and she sees holiness in that. Seeing that as a form of ministry, that was new. That came with the Reformation. For women in Christian history, it has always been a baggage to be a woman. You're born with female sexuality, and that has posed a problem for men, especially for spiritual men. For a woman to hear the word of gospel, that you are created by God the way you are as a holy human being, you don't have to live in a monastery to do that. You can do that if that's your calling, but you don't have to. That was pure gospel for women.